Good afternoon. Works? Yeah. I think what makes sense is that first you introduce yourself shortly, and then I will ask you some things about theories, about the science part of your work, and then second half I ask both of you some questions about, let's say, the artistic part of your work as musicians. So, Melle, you can
Yes.
start.
Well, I prepared kind of a short talk, but I'll try to trim it down to kind of introduce what I do, mostly academically. So for a long time, I've been thinking about the musical and the sonic appeal of noise. So why people listen to it, why we're drawn to it, and why we like it, because. In a lot of the literature, either implicitly or explicitly, noise is taken as something that is different from proper musical sound. I know many of you will already disagree, but it's still kind of the implicit tendency. So it's often associated with objection, with transgression, with violence, subversion, chaos, dissonance, aggression. And I always found that very unsatisfactory because I also think that there's something profoundly beautiful and positive about noise. So I'm in my dissertation that I wrote, finished last year. I tried to kind of pin down that aspect, and I argue that it's that important role, that kind of more positive role of noise, is intimately related to the rise of technological sound reproduction. So machines that can record and store and transmit, reproduce, manipulate sound. So I tried to define that relation between the rise of technical media, the growing importance of noise, and the emergence of all kinds of new sounds, new kinds of music, new kinds of musical sensibility over the past 140 years. So I write about phonographs and gramophones and magnetic tape and analog to digital converters and noise reduction, dithering, all kinds of technical stuff. Kind of the long chain of technologies that each affect the sound that comes out of the speakers in the end. And as such, I try to build a case against an ideology of perfect fidelity. So against the idea that every sound recording ideally should be the same as the original that it reproduces. Because that ideology is kind of the root of the myth that noise is something unwanted, external, something that should be erased, eliminated. So the basic thesis is that it's because all the links between sender and receiver, so all the cables and microphones and amplifiers, compressors, switches, wires, everything we see lined up across this room, shape the sound in specific and significant ways. It's not the input signal and not the output signal that's important for understanding what sound recording, what sound media are, but the channels in between. So everything that happens in between the input and the output, all the kind of random alterations that creep in, noisy traces of recording and reproduction media. So I say that these traces constitute an essential element of what we consider music since Edison invented the phonograph in 1877. So essentially my project set out to think about the role of noise in musical practices, and I started looking at sound recording to understand noise. And in the end, it turned out that noise was actually a way to better understand, thinking about noise is a better way to understand what sound recording actually is and does, and how it changed the sound of music. So that is what I did in the 4 years at the University of Amsterdam up to the beginning of this year. And now I'm at the University of Cambridge doing what I now consider kind of a prequel to that research. So I'm traveling back to look at the origin of that ideology of perfect fidelity, of that ideology of sonic purity, back from the 20th century, from sound media to 19th century acoustics. And I already did some of those things in my thesis, and I'm trying to expand on that. So a stronger focus on 19th century acoustics, the physics of sound, the conceptualization of the physical of sound in terms of a spectrum, and the concept of the sine wave as one pure frequency. The idea that there's such a thing as one pure unaffected frequency. So I'm trying to look at through some archival work, looking at the writings of people, physicists, but also a lot of kind of conceptual work and the history of science. Look how ancient ideas about harmony and order are still very much ingrained in some of the concepts and models that we use to approach music. So that's basically what I do.
Thank you, Melle. Gabriel?
Yes. Okay, so I asked a little bit about doing an introduction also to what I've been doing for a while. I think it's interesting to take from Melle, and it's an interesting continuity also, the fact that we meet here. I mean, we met like 4 or 5 years ago. He was still working on that on the thesis, and I think there are many kind of underlying points of contact. Coming more from basically this artistic practice, me as a composer and sound artist and also performer, already this performance today will get me back to my roots as a piano player. Basically, the point where my interest in working with sound and technology started, I would say they connect to maybe 2 main roots. One of them, and in very concrete terms, that had to do with the beginning of a work with the theater dance company, had to do with dealing with the issue of making a work that had to do with the stage and with the use of soundtrack in the domain of theater and dance. And there was something I wasn't happy about, which was the fact that there was too much reliance on accepting that the loudspeaker setup was there and that we were making as if it wasn't there. So that could spring into many different ramifications, like issues of acousmatic tradition and many others. But basically, there was something that I was concerned there, which is that I said, I mean, we actually know that it is there. I mean, why pretend that it's not there? And that basically got me interested in the fact that there's particular conditions that make the sound experience be what it is. And basically, my connection with technology from that point on had to do with the fact that technology is embedded in our auditory reality, at least since the last, I don't know, maybe 70 years or something, and it's developing more and more. So basically the connection there with technology was not so much about extending into another reality, a kind of alien or foreign reality of sound, but actually relating to how that technology is embedded in ways and modes that define how we hear in the everyday and also in our music culture. The other point, or the other trigger point, was something that became a very specific interest, almost maybe an obsession at some point, with creating a kind of sonorous experience that basically exposes the listener in a particular moment to all those conditions and traces that make you experience it in that way. It's a bit circular, it might sound a bit strange, but I mean, I probably experienced that a couple of times, and it became a kind of a motor in a way to try to get that moment in which I don't care if it's music or if it's not music or what it is, but basically try to create that situation in which one is not listening to a sound as a figure in a discourse, for example, or as a part of a tradition or not tradition, as I said, if it's music or it's not music, but it's actually one is kind of, there is some inner question happening there as to why am I experiencing it like that. There is like the traces of histories and affective contents that are playing at that moment. So that kind of shaped a little bit my work that I've been involved for a while with technology and in a way that dialogues with what Melle was talking about. I mean, about all these internal conditions, technological and historical, that play in the circuit of sound recording, manipulation and reproduction.
Thank you, Gabriel. Theoretical discussions often start with, let's say, definitions of terms. And Melle used the word noise. You didn't use the word noise. You used the word music. Just to have in our minds, and then we can forget it again. But when does sound, well, you use the word sound a lot. When does sound become music for you? And well, even when you can say it in one more sentence, when does noise become music for you? And I will also ask it to you, Melle first.
That's a trick question. Well, I was talking about that recently. The stupidest answer I always give to say what the definition of music is from my first year studying musicology, where one of the professors said, well, music is everything that humans call music, which is a completely useless definition. It gets you nowhere, but it's also the only one that kind of rings through true in every circumstance, because it's just, you know, if a group or maybe 2 or 3 people agree that this is music. So I'm really not so sure whether I'm interested in that question of differences. I was afraid you were going to ask what is noise, because that is a question, of course, I've been kind of thinking about for years, and there's a whole set of definitions depending on whether you talk about communication theory or 19th century acoustics, or and the English word noise is very inconvenient because it has a lot of meanings.
You prefer Rausch?
Rauschen in German, or Ruis in Dutch are already more specific and more useful. So in my I start my introduction also with these German terms because it's at least gives you something, but still there's a slippage. So yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe let's see what Gabriel says.
Because you don't in the article you send us, you don't use a word like noise at all.
Yeah, I mean, as Melle's thesis and several other pieces of bibliography show, I mean, the noise concept opens up to so many different parts that it's difficult to grasp them all together. But I mean, there is, on the one hand, this always moving threshold, right? I mean, there is always this aspect that, if we think, for example, in the realm of Western classical music, that we can investigate different degrees of involvement with noise, right? I mean, in the sense of how, for example, in early music, I mean, aspects of the noisier way that you would attack a string instrument were a bigger part of the music than it became later in Romanticism, and how, like, so many things that we think about Romanticism shaped a way of an ideal sound as kind of model of what music should use. So in that sense, we can get into this threshold of variability in which it's always a cultural process, and using Douglas's Kahn quote there about noise is always rendered to processes that render it non-existent. I mean, to processes that render it non-noise, right? I mean, the moment that we are decodifying, it stops being noise because it becomes a piece of signal, let's say. Yeah, but if I can jump a bit more to the other side, to the side of the music question and the definitions, I think, I mean, just to give a kind of more operative sentence, so not so much about giving an answer, but giving a cue, I think we are in a moment and that we have to, I don't know how to put it strongly, but I mean, we have to really allow ourselves to wipe out a lot of worries that we had from the past about choosing on which tradition are we, if we need to step up in a musical tradition or a sound art tradition. I mean, we have nowadays such a wide accessibility to so many different trends that I think it's much worthwhile to really ask ourselves what are the questions that we want to put into work, rather than worrying if we are in one or this other trend.
And now you're going in your work into details, and one of the details is that you both speak, as well as musicians, as theorists, about music and electronic processes. I mean, the intermedium between making a sound and the listener listening to a sound, and what's happening in between. And I think that's one of the most important things that your work has in common.
Yeah, well, I would say you say music and electronic or recording processes. I would say it's recording processes as music or as musical. So what I try to kind of get rid of is the idea that there's something happening in a sound studio or wherever, and then there's a way to get that to the listener, and then it gets played. Now everything that happens in between is part of the musical experience of the listener, shapes the musical experience of the listener, and of course everyone that works in a sound studio or as a sound engineer knows that 90% of what you're doing is trying to get the sound right, and what right is not this kind of ideal platonic purity, but it's something kind of visceral. Because what I was thinking earlier, I think one of the things that might be interesting in kind of defining noise, or I'm not such a big fan of the idea that noise stops being noise. That's an information theory kind of approach, and it's because on the other hand, for instance, Henri Atlan, he's a biologist. Influence on Michel Serres, the philosopher, and he so this kind of these biological processes of randomness, or Brownian processes that stay random. So the randomness itself is part of what that is, and what kind of how things take shape. And the randomness doesn't disappear. The randomness is still, so the noisiness is still part of the texture. So I think that the turn towards a certain materiality of sound, and then, so you talk about processes. I think there's a kind of a continuum between kind of processes and materiality. So materiality, the material is not static. It's something that is affected upon and that affects the sound. So there's a constant kind of going back and forth that's become so much more important. That's also important with these early music, with how you play a string instrument. But because we can now capture it in a way, or trying to kind of look at it through a much more detailed way, it became this thing in itself, I think. I'm not sure whether this makes sense, but.
No, I was going to mention just that because you brought this question about I don't know if it was exactly the direction you were aiming, but a question about what defines their music in relation to this the preeminence of electronic processes. I think there's something interesting there about how it defines also practices of listening, right? Yeah. And how, let's say, probably it questions the model of the subject which produces a sound, that there's a kind of a model that we put also as a relationship to sound, that we are waiting for the sound to express or to be this rendering of the subject which is expresses.
You also refer to the French philosopher Gilbert Simondon. Can you shortly explain what he's saying about this subject? He doesn't talk so much about this subject. That's a little bit. I'll try to explain, because he's referring to an article. That's about processes and about. Yes. Okay. Yeah. They are taking it from that point. Yes. Basically, what I take, or in my a little bit of a research I'm doing on Simondon recently, and that's part of an article that is coming out soon. I'm interested in his notion of image and imagination, and basically what I found very interesting, and I'm kind of trying to translate into the domain of sound, and thinking about the notion, which is of course not new, but it's let's say quite paradoxical, has a lot of questions in it, which is the idea of a sound image or an acoustic image. And what I found very interesting in Simondon is that he makes a couple of very strong movements towards the notion of image. One of them is to take it out of a notion of a fixed content, right? So an image is no longer a kind of fixed content, either in a brain or whatever medium. The image is basically a kind of node. It's an instant which is always transforming, and it has to do with this point of interaction between an agent and an environment. And it's difficult to summarize several things, but basically if I try to so the image is this point of articulation in which there is a dialogue between always a kind of a process of continuous forming and the process of perception as a kind of reactualization of that forming. And then we come to the role of the listener. Yes. Basically,
what I want to bring from there, and what I find interesting in the listener, is actually to show how this non-fixedness of the image is always happening, because there's always the interaction between an agent and environment is always being shaped by particular situations. And that's where I put technology in, let's say, as technology as being a kind of a set of protocols, a set of practices and habits that also, as a circuit, define how we engage with certain sounds, right? Like, I don't know, to try to bring a bit more to concrete words. I mean, I'm thinking, also to connect with Melle and on the thesis and talking about the process of noise reduction, and for example, talk about the invention of silence in the domain of reproduction technology. And that's an interesting aspect of building a particular condition within the frame of a practice, right? Or the role of hissing noises of recording, and how, because they take part of our culture, and as listeners we learn to decode that material, then that defines how we engage with that sound, and that's how the sound image becomes a kind of...
What interests me is to what extent is it a purely subjective or a purely objective situation. For instance, you have projects that you put speakers on all kind of places in a room, and you can walk along them, and what you hear, is that for every listener the same, or do you think that's for every listener completely different? I mean, like architecture, you mentioned architecture is part of the way you can listen to sounds, or does influence is one of the things that influences. You can say the architecture, that's a stable fact, but to which extent is it for every listener? What is the role of the listener?
Well, I think it's a collective formation. So of course it will be looked from that point of view. Yes, it will be different for everyone. In the same way that if we talk about it materially, so also going away from the idea of a subjective mind that is interpreting things differently. But even if you think about it materially, the fact that sound is being basically a rendering of a particular oscillation point at each one's ear. So even from that point of view, you will have the difference in all of them. But I think the point of view is not this one of separating between subjective and objective. Again, if this Simondonian way of problematizing the engagement, again, it's problematizing a collective event rather than saying that it's different between the subjective and the objective.
Well, there's an interesting. If you look at this 19th century situation that I'm kind of going into now. So the moment that there's the beginning of a proper understanding of how the physicality of sound works. So the introduction of Fourier analysis, for instance, to kind of understand what the superposition of frequencies is, and how that sound is not just one, but it's multiple, and what the role of overtones in sound. And there's an interesting kind of, you see basically a moment of crisis with people like Helmholtz, who on the one hand still have this kind of classical Western idea of there has to be an order and a harmony in a way, maybe not in the classical sense, but at least some kind of order. Whereas there's also the clear realization that, one, the physical facts are being interpreted both by our physiologies and by what our ears do, and that's still a point that's not entirely understood. And what our brains do to it. So there's physics, there's physiology, and there's psychology or psychoacoustics. And this moment in the mid 19th century, when there's initially this, we can just kind of start to look at nature, use mathematics to come up with models that kind of help us penetrate what the structure of nature is, so of sound, of heat, of electricity, of magnetism, all these kinds of. And then you get to a point that, okay, but actually what do these models tell us? And there are all kinds of things that we actually don't perceive, or we perceive it very different from what the kind of the physical parameters are. So there's this interesting kind of moment, and that's very much part also of what sound media are, because you start to have media that supposedly objectively just kind of reproduce what you put into it. But then again, that's not really the case, because they always kind of alter it in one way or another. They also always affect it in one way or another. So you get these kind of mirrors almost of our own fallibility in not being able to exactly know and control how it works. I'm always kind of the larger thing I'm interested in is that there's always an aspect of kind of human failure there, in when we try to get it, to understand it, to reproduce it, and then get to a point where that doesn't work. And I think that's where a lot of kind of beauty and art comes in, actually. In
Exactly,
that moment.
but I think when we're talking about science, is try to find out to which parts of the whole process are fixed and are objective in that way, and which parts are open. So that was one of the things what I read in your article. There are quite a lot of fixed parameters. I mean, the electronics that you use, and the architecture of the room, etc. And then the listener comes in, and that's. And I was just wondering, how big is that part? I mean, can that change the whole story or not?
But I think what you call fixed might not be that fixed. I think that's part of. And I'm speaking for Gabriel as well. But so I'm always in the. So there's of course a lot of things that you try to control or try to kind of meticulous setup, but the serendipity of what happens in the moment. Because it's not only the architecture, it's also the temperature of the room, for instance. Isn't it? So there's always these aspects that are not, and then there's the subject coming in with a subjective.
Yeah, but talking in theory is you can when you know that the temperature of the room plays a part, you can fix the temperature of the room.
Yes.
I mean.
But that's part of that
theory.
kind of ideology that I talk about. That's still very strong in the 19th century. There's kind of the idea that we can get to a point where we know the whole picture.
Yeah, of course. I mean, a score, the classical score, is in a way. I mean, a lot of scores are useless now because of electronics and other parts you can't put in a score. But the score was started as one. This is the way when you play it like this, you get the music.
Yeah, but you could put it like this, but it could also. I'm not sure whether I think it started as just a way to kind of remember certain aspects. So there's also a kind of the friction there between, in many ways it's just like a mental note.
Let's talk about. Oh, you want to?
No, just maybe a small thing on this. That maybe on the motivation also, because you're referring on my work on that. I mean, there's not so much of this dialectic between control and non-control. I mean, it's more an interest in, and also not on separating the listeners, but actually thinking about the listener, as I said, I mean, as part of a circuit. So, and that's why I was trying to emphasize when I said that it's collective. It's collective and it's material always. I mean, in the sense that there are these conditions of how sound is produced that shape in a way how a certain way of hearing is developed, and the other way around. And this is a circuit. And again, I mean, it's more the idea for making this work is problematizing that circuit, but not so much like controlling or not controlling an aspect of it.
Could you say? I'm just wondering that the listening subject is part of your compositional process. In a way, it always is for everybody, of course. But in China, because you're after these kinds of effects, these moments of altering.
Yes, from that point of view, it is central in that sense.
Yeah.
In that sense, yes.
It brings me to the next stage of this talk. That at you as musicians, and you were just mentioning it, you both are what's called theorists nowadays in a way, and you both are musicians. to which extent do your let's say your theoretical ideas about music influence your work as a musician?
Shall I go?
Yeah.
So honestly, how to put it? I mean, I never decided how it was going to be. I mean, in a way, both things happened in different ways and from different trigger and entry points at several stages in my path. To be slightly, not to be boring, but just slightly biographical. I mean, I studied philosophy for a couple of years, a very long time ago, actually, before deciding I was going to spend much more time doing sound and music. And after I did that move, actually, for almost maybe 10 years, I actually wasn't reading almost any theory, and suddenly I went back at some moment. But to me, it was always just always a matter of asking questions from both sides. I mean, I never saw the artistic practice without asking questions, and in theory it was the same. My interest was the same, and then to me it was always also like a way of thinking about crossing any kind of artistic instance. I mean, I also wasn't thinking about myself starting to do music or sound because I wanted to be a musician, but it was just it happened to be something I was doing, but it could have been also with film writing or whatever. I mean, it had to do with crossing paths and this kind of process. So.
Well, very different, I think. So for a long time, for a while, I saw it as two relatively separate things. But it's of course always also fooling myself. But it's also kind of a strategy to, this is that part of my life, and this is this part of my life. My parents are both musicians, and I've been kind of. I grew up with music, so there's always also the practical side. As a musician, playing the violin when I was little, but also, a non-academic engagement with music. And then with what I do with Glice, and of course I'm a duo, so it's the two of us, and I think we come in a way from. Well, we have we know each other for a long time, and we've played in bands before, but we also come from a different kind of approach in how we do this. So Glice is in many ways trying not to be. So there's no concept. So the idea is just it's what we do at that moment. There's very little trying to kind of express something theoretically. But then on the other hand, I always felt, coming from musicians, parents, and I was always a bit of a failed musician in the sense that I don't play any instrument really well, and so there's always this kind of frustration of I want to do something kind of. And Glice is the one thing where I know that I'm good. The thing what I know I'm good in is sound. Is kind of trying to build something, and it's always improvised. So there's this moment of trying to, and so that idea of control and of trying to fight the machines in a way, trying to go back and forth between, okay, what is happening here? Does it still make sense? Is it not? And getting better at that. And that's so in a way that is really, it comes maybe from a similar kind of interest, but it's a whole different kind of way of expressing it.
To put it maybe a bit abstract, talking to, and there's a popular view, and especially the popular view I mentioned, that when I'm interviewing, for instance, pop musicians, and something I hear very often is that they say, don't let me analyze my work because then the creativity disappears. Yeah. And that's what you always hear from pop musicians. And when I interview, for instance, composers, they say, inspiration, I'm solving a problem. Composers are solving problems. And the interesting thing is that jazz musicians are somewhere in between. So that's the reason I asked this to you, this question about, because you're both scientists, so you're extremely thinking compared to other composers or musicians about it. And there are even people who say that, well, analyzing my music would be fatal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think that's part of just a romantic idea of what art is. From the moment you study, so I studied musicology originally, and when you study musicology, people say, "Oh, musicology, you can't talk about music, and you shouldn't write about music, and you can't analyze music." And like, why? You can, of course, you can as much as you can with any other art form, and of course, there's also parts that is, and so, you know, philosophy in a way is a way to kind of go between the two. So I wouldn't say I'm not a. You can also be study music from a physical point of view, and people do that. But trying to kind of come to grips with that, the uncertainty in the middle, the thing that is not clearly defined, I think is the interesting part of trying to kind of and be as specific as possible in writing and research. But specific in this case is not. It's not objective. It's not. You're not trying to solve a puzzle in a way that that a physicist might do it. So it's just trying to think through. Okay, what is happening here? And I think especially with sound technology, and that's also why it's interesting that what I'm doing, because it's so kind of the materiality of it is so evident in when you're on stage. It always puzzled me how long it took before we really started to confront in academia the fact that the question of sound recording. That there are throughout the history examples, and people wrote about it, but and in a kind of larger structural way, saying music is just something fundamentally different. It has the fact that we can reproduce sounds is phenomenal.
But
And what that is, I think we've only just started to think about what that actually kind of means.
well, that brings me to a next point, which I think has to do with this, because for
In
centuries, music had to do with melody, harmony, and
the
rhythm,
West.
and especially not only electronic music, but let's say modern music in general, things like. Um, Texture, for instance, texture and also energy in the way of the role of the volume, are relatively new elements in music, and I mentioned because for both of you, those elements play a part in music, in electronics and in the music you make with Glice. Um, in which extent, and that's maybe bit out of this discussion, but are those elements, is your experience, accepted as musical elements? Do you still have to discuss with listeners, and not in your own small circle, but when you more general listeners, that that texture can be as interesting or as important as melody or harmony is, for instance?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, or it's difficult to put it in the context of a social situation of communication, let's say, and how much and what validates or not doesn't validate to how much communication we might have with different contexts. But I think, well, again, there are several things playing, but on the one hand, I think that something that came up through some of the things we both mentioned in the talk is that actually, because you just mentioned now technology, I mean, there are several aspects of the role of technology in, as I said, also in auditory practices and the realm that we're used to, that actually put a lot of this awareness of the effect that sound produces on ourselves away from those traditional musical parameters. I mean, the fact that we go to the cinema and there are so many aspects about sound design and how keen we become to recognize aspects of reverb, of the materiality of sound through all those aspects of sound culture. So suddenly sound culture is no longer only about harmony and rhythm and those criteria of let's say a kind of Western canon of musical practice. So in that sense, there is there are many aspects of sound that through other parts of culture become valuable, become relevant effectively and culturally. So again, I mean, the question has a lot of layers because it involves also the tradition of the avant-garde and more than 100 years of having moved away from the traditional parameters or the traditional the main notions of pitch, duration, harmony, rhythm as structures of music. So, but sorry, just finish connecting back to your previous questions about the theory. I mean, again, to me, the one of the main points is to get it back to the questions, get it back to the possibility of art, asking strong questions about how we live, how we think, how we feel, how we understand. And I think that's the point where, yeah.
But for instance, the piece that you got the Gaudiamus-prijs for, well, what's called the Rex Externa?
Extensa.
Extensa. It's, I think it's a beautiful piece, but it's far away from what a lot of people call music. You can even say, is it music or is it sound art? And that's a very fascinating part of it. That the borders between music, visual art, environment art, etc., are disappearing.
It always puzzled me. I remember, so a lot of years ago, I think it was a review of a Björk record at some point, where there was, this is no longer music, this is art. And maybe it was, this is no longer pop music, this is art, but I'm not sure. Which I always found, okay, so where's the threshold between the two? You know, what's the, but of course there's a very strong value judgment. Depending on the context, so in this case, I would think it was like a negative value judgment. So it becomes artsy-fartsy, difficult stuff. So it's no longer just property. But
that are layers upon each other.
Yeah,
it's lower and higher art, but you can also talk about things beside each other.
Yeah, but I think that in many ways, I agree. But also calling it one or the other, there is often kind of an implicit idea about the context in which it is presented and the people that are kind of working in that context. And one of the things I was thinking earlier, what I found when I was explaining throughout the years what I worked on in my thesis, so the importance of noise in sound recording was my elevator pitch. I work on the importance of noise in sound recording. And then often dealing with musicologists, they were like, oh, okay, yeah. And then some questions. When I was talking to sound engineers, they immediately got at least, why it would be interesting. And I think part of what you said with the sound, so I think a lot of these things about sonority and texture and are implicit parts of our everyday culture. So most people will understand them, but not necessarily kind of talk about it in the way that we would, or talk about it in a musical way. Of course, so the tradition of musicology and kind of studying music academically has for a long time excluded many of those elements for many reasons. But it's not because they weren't part of music. Texture was always, as soon as something sounds, there's a sonic texture to it. And so, yeah, it's a very...
It gets extreme when musicians leave the melody and the rhythm.
Yeah, when you leave everything out. Yeah.
For instance, and everybody calls them, that's the best example is for Merzbau. Merzbau is about texture and energy.
Yeah.
And so you can make a musical piece out of those two elements. And that is, well, it's like for a lot of people, well, now it's accepted when you have a completely abstract painting, just black or just white. And you can make that from out of all kind of different theories, but it is accepted as being a painting. And I think that's the same. That in music we're not that far, I think.
But again, we come to a really problematic area of traditions and histories, because what you're saying about painting, that's from more than 100 years ago, right? And within music, it is also like that. I mean, we can strive for let's say spreading knowledge about traditions as much as possible, and that seems like a good thing to do that many of us try to do. But at the same time, it would be nice to, as I said a bit before, to get to a point in which we can kind of make some things a little bit break apart in terms of being so much concerned about traditions and being able to pose questions. Because, I mean, even the question about sound art, I mean, that relates a lot to many different cultural layers and how the notion of sound art has, if we looked at the last 5 decades, I mean, it has changed. I mean, the moment that Max Neuhaus started talking about sound art several decades ago, it had particular function. That changed maybe 20 years ago, and that changed again already 5 years ago, where sound art was appropriated by other people. So, in that sense, again, we would need like 1 more hour at least to get into all these shades. But yes, I mean, I think it would be nice to accept and to look at what all these particular moments in time brought out, and not try to choose sides as a kind of a history that we've had about that, but mainly about saying how each of these points has brought up certain particular questions or problems, and how we can deal with them and continue to raise relevant issues.
Well, but I think there is something in Matsbau is always an interesting example of saying, you know, I would still not say that I actually enjoy listening to that. But I find it very interesting, and there are moments that are, but so, and I know there are people that really say I enjoy listening, and so that's an experience. But I also think that there is a question of the specificity of our sensory, of our senses, where what is happening with something, with music or sound like Matsbau, is there is a profound overload of information that many people just find unpleasant, or at least very confronting. Whereas, especially the black painting, that's very easily, you know, you can relate to it in many ways. You can have the whole kind of academic way of trying to interpret it, or trying to, or just accept it as it is. But it's much less evasive, or kind of invasive in a way. So there is something about. And I'm always hesitant to say that, you know, music is emotion and music, but there is something very profound in. So on the one hand, it's how people raised, and our ears are wired in a certain way. So if you're not exposed to certain sounds, you know, you can learn about it, and you can kind of open your field. But it's also, there's a kind of a cultural layer there. So we should, I think that the question, it's not just a question of aesthetics, but it's also just a question of the different modes of perception.
It's often said that of all the senses that music is the most threatening in a way, and also
there can be a lot of violence.
What goes deepest, more than other disciplines of art. Before I ask you, the audience, if there are any questions, I've one last question for Melle, and maybe also for Gabriel, but especially for Melle in this case, because you open your thesis with a couple of lines about Einstürzende and Neubauten, because you, in fact, you haven't read it, but you started your first dissertation because you were fascinated by the middle work, I would say later work, the middle work of Einstürzende and Neubauten, and then you got back to their first album, Collapse, and then you even got more fascinated, and that was for you the starting point, because you wanted to know about it, and you wanted to know what was so special about it, and that was for you the reason to start this whole study.
Yeah.
But in the conclusion of the whole study, there's nothing about
appear.
Neubauten.
No.
So what I want to ask you is, after working 4 years on this, what do you understand better about Collapse now?
I still intend to write a book on the album at some point, but well, so the initial that's why I started the introduction with it is that there was a bachelor thesis now more than 10 years ago that was about the Neubauten, and it tried to kind of, it was my first attempt at some of these questions, and one of the one of the things that I'm still convinced, and I've kind of concluded that there, and that's, and I'm more convinced of that now, is that the mythology that they themselves started about this whole, we threw away all conventions and we started banging on all kinds and using scrap metal, and that's all fine and good. But what actually made them kind of what they are is what happened in that studio there. The fact that they are not these kind of, or not only these kind of radical, throw everything out of the window, but they are very keen listeners and have a very keen kind of specific ear for sound. And I think they recorded the album in a week or something like that. So the addition of being in a studio and also having that kind of element of experimenting, as you know, we've recorded with Alexander Hacke of the Neubaute earlier, and this is clearly someone that from his early teens has been working with sound equipment. It's basically part of his being.
Without any musical theory.
Yeah, but so that's also, of course, part of what, in a way, sound technology allowed for more than previous, that you can just push buttons, see what happens, and if you like it, you record it, and then you can start. So there's something very kind of tangible and so it's without musical theory, but they're very, with a lot of skill and kind of precision and knowledge that might not have been explicit, but implicit. Yeah.
Gabriel, is there now, since you have been studying and theorizing a lot about music, is there music from, let's say, from your youth? Because I know from Melle that he was talking about Neubaut. I don't know where you listened to when you were 15 or so, but because of your theories and your study on theory, is it? Do you understand much of that music much better, or can't you understand any more that you did just liked it in those days? You were a metalhead or something, or
yeah, I don't know if I could say that I understand better. Probably not. I was just thinking, I was curious when you said before about the origins and the relation with theory. I found it funny when you talked about jazz musicians and you said they were in the middle. Maybe that was a whole explanation, because I'm originally a jazz musician, so maybe that was the thing. But yeah, again, to me, it goes back to this kind of circle, which is always happening. If I think about those origins, and if you ask me biographically about the moment that I discovered Charlie Parker, I mean, to me that is actually as present as ever. I mean, that moment of finding that moment in which there's something that kind of breaks in your experience of sound, which is something that becomes like out of the context of what you were grasping before, and it's non-rational. So at any moment, theory doesn't have anything to do here with the rational or with the deductive. It has to do with understanding or trying to get deeper into, let's say, schemes or practices of how you grasp and you experience things.
But for Melle, for Melle, it was kind of the key moment, or later, that I have to know more about this. And was that also with you?
Again, it was parallel. Again, it was at the same time that it was Charlie Parker. It was cinema, and it was philosophy, and it was that. I mean, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Is there anybody in the audience who has questions? You have been very clear. No questions. So then it's time for a drink, I think. Yeah? Okay, thank you very much.